Welcome to the second day of the AERC. This morning we're starting off with the Murray N. Rothbard Memorial Lecture, and it's sponsored by Steve and Cassandra Torello. Our speaker is Dr. Patrick Newman. He's a fellow of the Mises Institute and assisting teaching professor at the University of Economics at the University of Tampa. He received his BA from Rutgers University and his PhD from George Mason University. Dr. Newman is the author of Cronyism, Liberty versus Power in Early America, 1607 to 1849, and editor of Murray Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty, The New Republic, 1784 to 1791, and also Rothbard's The Progressive Era. His newest book, Cronyism, Rise of the Corporatist State, 1849 to 1929, he loves these dates, will be released in the early fall of 2025. Today, he'll speak to us about how executive power can dismantle the deep state. Dr. Newman?
All right, well, thank you, everyone, for attending. My name is Patrick Newman. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Steve and Cassandra Torello for sponsoring this talk. This means a lot to me. I'd also like to thank Dr. Joseph Salerno for inviting me to give the Murray N. Rothbard Memorial Lecture. Rothbard has had a tremendous influence on me, whether in economics, history, politics, strategy. You know, Rothbard believed in a unified science of liberty that could provide the theoretical edifice of Austrian economics, the empirical illustrations of government failures and how the free market works, and of course the strategy for actually achieving the free market libertarianism in our time. So in that spirit, I've decided to give a talk on how executive power can dismantle the deep state. So in line with President Donald Trump's initiative to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse from the government, I spent all last night trying to do the same to my PowerPoint. So I'm fairly successful. I eliminated the waste, the fraudulent analysis, but I can't promise that you won't feel abused by the end of this. So anyway, so I'd like to begin. So what is this presentation about and why should you care? So I have three parts to the presentation, and they are as follows. I first want to talk about why attempts to reform the government over the past 40 plus years, basically since 1980, have failed. There's been many attempts to reform the federal government in the United States, at least from a free market, conservative, libertarian perspective, small government in some way, and they really have not worked. So I want to talk about that. Then I want to talk about how the Jacksonians dismantled the American system. Murray Rothbard was a big fan of the Jacksonians, and I'm going to argue is that they were really the only successful libertarian mass movement in the United States to actually bring about meaningful policy changes. So I want to talk about those, and I want to talk about how they did that. And then I want to talk about Jacksonian lessons for today, some things that the Trump administration has done that I think are in the spirit of Jackson, as well as, of course, something that future administrations could do. I'm firmly convinced that the playbook, the Jacksonian playbook, whether or not it succeeds in the current administration, will be used at some point if we are to, quote, achieve liberty in our time. All right, so let's talk about the downsizing failures. All right, so since 1980, conservatives and libertarians in their own ways have tried to reduce the power of the federal government, right? We saw the Reagan Revolution, right? Ronald Reagan elected president in 1980, and in his inaugural address, he famously said, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." So you're thinking like, okay, this is going to be a real hack and slash at all of the New Deal in the later interventions after World War II. We saw Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House in the 1990s, in the Contract with America. We saw George Bush, and he's campaigning here, and believe it or not, it says debt-free America. He wanted to balance the budget, and he promised to keep us out of foreign wars. So, got that. We have the Tea Party, the Tea Party revolution in 2010, building on the initiative of Ron Paul's Campaign for Liberty. The Tea Party taxed enough already, right, promising small government changes in Congress. And then in 2016, we have Donald Trump, who promised famously to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C., root out the corruption, and so on. All right, so what are the results? I could go through a bunch of charts and tables and stuff. I think we can just summarize them in really two charts. When we look at the size of the government spending has increased during this time. As a percentage of GDP, government spending has increased. There's been some periods of decrease, but really it's just been going up, and it's been greater than tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, which has remained constant. So that means the federal debt as a percent of GDP has been going up, and especially in the 21st century, up, especially during crises, 2008 financial crisis and COVID, right? All right, so then what about the scope of government? What about the regulatory state? During this period, we've seen new departments added: Department of Education, Department of Veterans Affairs, Department of Homeland Security. Then, of course, we can't forget agencies like the Bureau, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We've got new regulatory initiatives: Americans with Disabilities Act, Sarbanes-Oxley, Dodd-Frank, Obamacare, right? You're just being inundated with all of the new regulations. And we look at the total pages of federal regulations in thousands, and the number's gone up, right? Certainly we would say there's some waste, fraud, and abuse there, but really reform efforts have not succeeded at meaningfully constraining government spending or regulation. So why is this, right? Why have these attempts failed? I would argue that these attempts have failed because of the so-called deep state, right? The entrenched interests. So when I'm thinking of the deep state, what came to my mind, and I was trying to think about this as sort of as academic as possible, was something kind of like this. Mordor, you've got Bardor, you've got Mount Doom, it's the land of shadow, and I want to obviously talk about the deep state, but I think this is really what a lot of people have in mind, sort of this group of nefarious interests that are basically blocking any meaningful change. All right, so what is the deep state? A lot of people talk about this. Several decades ago, this was called the American establishment or the Eastern establishment. Now we kind of have this idea of the deep state. On the surface, our federal government is constrained. There's a separation of powers. There's checks and balances. Our government just can't do everything at once. We have a constitution. Our government's also accountable to the people, right? We can cycle in new politicians, the people who better reflect their constituents' preferences. And of course, our government promotes the public interest, right? This is what we hear time and time again, whether in the media or in the university system and so on, and of course from the government itself, right? But in reality, underneath the surface, sort of deeper down, so to speak, our government exercises unrestrained power. Right? It can pretty much do whatever it wants, right? Especially during crises. It's resistant to change. There's really a uniparty, more or less, controlling Washington, D.C. and the rest of the federal apparatus. And our government, of course, doles out cronyism to powerful special interests. It passes special interest policies that don't actually promote the public interest, but they just provide favors to various interest groups, subsidies, discriminatory taxes, beneficial regulations, and so on. And for more on the deep state, I highly encourage everyone to listen to a lecture given by Tate Fegley at this year's Mises University, Bureaucrats in the Deep State, where it's applied specifically to sort of our national security state. But this is what I think is the deep state. This is something that most people have in mind, right? So who runs the deep state? Right? It's not Sauron or anything like that. But it's people. But the people who are doing quite well, I would say. So one way of looking at it, and I think this table encapsulates what so many people find wrong with our current system. This is a ranking of the counties, the top 10 counties, according to median household income. All right, this is part of a research project I've been doing with Jeff Degner. But median household income is different than average, right? So average can include really rich billionaires and really poor people. Median is like middle. So, and of course, this is from 2019, so these numbers have only gone up. So Virginia, so Beltway, 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 Beltway. 5 out of 10 of the counties are located in a very concentrated area. This is a map of the counties in Northern Virginia and in Maryland. So there's our nation's capital, right? We all, County 1, County 2, County 3, County 4, County 5, right? There's something wrong with that. This isn't like around New York where you could at least make the argument financial services are produced, or around Los Angeles, you've got celebrities, or San Francisco, tech entrepreneurs and stuff like that. This is around our nation's capital, right? So clearly these people are, a lot of these people, the federal employees, the lobbyists, the politicians, the lawyers who say they aren't lobbyists, et cetera, they're doing very well, right? And this is why people are okay, much to the surprise of everyone in this area. They're okay with sort of weakening their power because they're doing much better than the average person. Right? All right, so the failure of past strategies. So the conservative libertarian playbook, in terms of political reform, I'm not going to talk about education and the importance of education, but just surely it's simply in terms of political reform, trying to achieve change in the here and now. All right, so you elect small government congressmen. All right, then you got to secure a majority. All right, so then when you have a majority, then you got to elect a small government president. All right, and then you also got to get small government judges. All right, so now you got to educate the bureaucrats because they're obviously in the machinery of government. You have to convince them. You have to bring them on your side. Okay, so then you've got the 3 branches combined. You are able to enforce the Constitution, right? It's like Captain Planet. Everyone sort of brings their rings together and we're able to achieve meaningful reform, okay? This doesn't work. Congress is too beholden to special interests in the constant election pressure. This is why attempts to reform through Congress have more or less met a dead end. Republicans, they cut taxes, they increase military spending, then they basically wait to pass any sort of meaningful budget reforms until after the midterms. Then they lose the midterms. Then the Democrats take over, they increase spending all around. And so the process just kind of repeats itself. Judges are, notoriously, we all know how the liberal judges are going to decide cases. It's like the conservative judges, you're like, okay, how are they going to go? And I'm always constantly reminded of Thomas Jefferson's quote that he said, the federal judiciary is the subtle core of sappers and miners who are constantly working underground to undermine the foundations of our confederated fabric. Right? The sappers and miners, it's very vivid. I'm sort of imagining like these little goblins, with pickaxes and dynamite, and I think that's fairly accurate. And of course, bureaucrats are too entrenched; they don't want to give up their power. So, what's the solution? I'm not guaranteeing I have obviously all the answers. I'm just thinking on the current strategy for the here and now, and what I think has worked in American history. I think we need to focus on using executive power to actually try to dismantle the deep state. I think I'm not saying this is guaranteed. I'm saying it's the most likely route to reform. There's been tons of issues with executive power. The Mises Institute has pioneered in really talking about all of the issues with executive power. President Tom DiLorenzo has a recent small little booklet, Axis of Evil, on some of the worst abuses of our presidents, and we have another book edited by John Denson, Reassessing the Presidency. Power corrupts, and it absolutely happens to presidents. I just think the executive is still the most likely way to achieve reform. The executive could veto interventionist bills and selectively use appropriations. I want to spend some time talking about something like impoundment, which is in the news. The executive could also issue executive orders to disenforce regulations. Executive orders are basically just sort of a command from the president to various parts of the executive branch, which is really where all of the federal government is housed, to do something. And it's always used to increase regulations, but you can also use them to decrease regulations. And we could also appoint allies to reduce bureaucratic personnel. So you try to get some like-minded people in the government to sort of get rid of the entrenched civil service, because they're not really going to change. It's not in their interests, right? So I think this is the most likely way of actually achieving reform in the 21st century. And I think someone like, if, for example, Ron Paul had ever become president, this would more or less be his playbook. I'm not talking about foreign policy. I just want to concentrate just on domestic policy, but in foreign policy, it would still be leading through the executive. So has this strategy actually worked before? And the answer is yes. I actually think this is the only strategy that's actually worked in American history. If we look at American history, the only time we've actually saw a weakening, a noticeable and relatively long-lasting weakening in the size of government was with the Jacksonians. The Jacksonian era, which I think is a gravely misunderstood. It's in the mid-1800s, basically from about 1830 to roughly 18, like the mid-1840s, let's say. So we have a long list of Jacksonian executives, at the federal and at the state level. We've got most famously Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, who ran on a campaign of, quote, reform, retrenchment, and economy in 1828. Reform, retrenchment, and economy. Right? Has a nice ring to it. Then you've got his assistant, one of my favorite presidents of all time, Martin Van Buren, MVB, the little magician who literally organized the Democrat Party to create it, to try to rescue it from all of the problems in the so-called era of corruption that preceded it. Then you have this guy, William Henry Harrison, but he died a month into office. So you've got John Tyler, his vice president, who had split with Andrew Jackson, who had once been part of the Democratic Party, but he pretty much was a Jacksonian executive. When you look at how he governed, he mainly governed through a strong executive, and he was able to achieve meaningful reforms. And then you've got James K. Polk, who was able to get several good things done at the economic level. He was young Hickory, close to Andrew Jackson. And I think these four presidents, the quadrumvirate, as I've called it, were actually able to achieve meaningful reform. Were they perfect? No. Do I agree with everything they've done? No. But as Murray Rothbard said, the Jacksonians were libertarians, plain and simple. And I do think there's a lot of truth in that statement. All right. So now I want to go to the second part, how the Jacksonians dismantled the American system. All right. How they actually were able to dismantle this American system. Now, what is the American system? The American system was basically the deep state of the past. It was this mighty edifice created by the Whigs and the National Republicans, central bank to benefit banks and provide selective credit subsidies, protective tariff to privilege northern manufacturers, and internal improvements to enrich land speculators, transportation companies, and try to bind the country together. So ostensibly, this was supposed to bring unity and benefit all of the regions, the North, the West, and the South. But in reality, this was more or less a way of privileging the North at the expense of the West and the South. So believe it or not, the Jacksonians were able to dismantle the American system. And this is why in my book, Cronyism, Liberty versus Power, I titled 2 chapters, Dismantling the American System. It's like you're literally breaking it up root and branch. You're actually able to eliminate things. You're able to achieve long-standing institutional reforms. Okay, so that's something very important to economists for long-term growth. All right, so what did they do? Well, at the federal level, they destroyed the central bank, right? So they got rid of the central bank, and then they instituted an independent treasury system to basically separate the federal government from banking. The federal government would only accept gold and silver in its payments. It was a great system, and it lasted for a bit. They enacted free trade tariffs. Okay. So what I mean by a free trade tariff is tariffs were how the government raised money. So barring a wonderful world where the government doesn't raise money, they have to raise money somehow. So it's basically through tariffs and land sales. And this was tariffs for revenue. So they were able to cut tariffs down from about 40% to about 20%. And this was seen as a big victory. And this was something also done in Great Britain, ushered in an era of free trade. They also restrained government spending. Wasn't always perfect at times, but the long-term trajectory of government spending was down. And they also paid down the federal debt. Andrew Jackson had actually eliminated the federal debt. And after it started to go up, after the Panic of 1837, it was back on a downward trajectory. And the long-term trend was something like the federal debt declined by about 2/3, which again is great. Like, it's not perfect, but we'll certainly take our victories when we can. We also can't forget at the state level. I just want to mention these just to show the types of long-lasting institutional changes. Unfortunately, I can't talk about the governors and all the efforts at the state level, but this did happen at the state level. The Jacksonians instituted various forms of free banking. So against the Whigs, who were at least looking to sort of privilege fractional reserve banks, the Jacksonians had various reforms of their own at the bank level, just trying to get rid of these so-called monopoly charters that the state legislatures would grant to fractional reserve banks to operate, trying to lower the regulatory barriers, also trying to prevent state legislatures from allowing banks to suspend the convertibility of their notes and deposits during panics. This was seen as a big privilege. The Jacksonians were also at the forefront of general incorporation laws, which were basically ways of, again, eliminating regulatory barriers for corporations instead of getting charters from the state governments. It basically allowed them to, with very minimal regulatory oversight, to create a transportation company or a manufacturing company. As various legal and historical scholars have noted, the Jacksonian general incorporation laws were like at the center of their laissez-faire thought, and also various constitutional amendments to restrict borrowing from state governments. And that, of course, is very important. So one of the best historians, I think, on the Jacksonians was Robert Kelly. And he wrote that by the mid-1840s, the Jacksonians created a, quote, community whose basic economic nature was shaped by the ideas of the Scotsman Adam Smith, right? So the invisible hand, right? Again, it's not it's not perfect, but the invisible hand, Smith's invisible hand, tremendously influenced the Jacksonians, as well as some more proto-Austrians like John Baptiste Say, and so on. And they really tried to actually embrace it, and I think they succeeded. The Jacksonian coalition, for various reasons, unfortunately kind of collapsed by 1846. But the important thing is that these reforms actually lasted for another, say, 15 years or so. And what was the effect of all of this? What was the effect of a community whose ideas were shaped by the invisible hand, so to speak? Right? It was the Industrial Revolution. America's first real industrial revolution did not begin with the Civil War, as used to be famously asserted. It began before the Civil War. Right? This was the period when we shifted away from artisanal shops to factories. We started to move away from, say, like turnpikes and canals to railroads. We were becoming more urban. This was sort of the embracing of modernity. And I, along with other historians, would argue that it was the result of the institutional reforms of the Jacksonians, right? Freer competition, right? With innovation, cheaper imports of iron rails. That's the benefit of having lower tariffs. We could import more efficiently, higher quality and lower cost British rails. That was very important for the railroad industry. In fact, indispensable. And more privatized transportation. Private funds created about 75% of, say, the private forces, provided about 75% of the funds for, say, railroads and other transportation networks during this time period, which was an improvement from before. Something I want to go through, a great statistic, because we think, you need tariffs to stimulate manufacturing. We actually don't. Manufacturing output as a share of commodity output increased from 17% in 1839 to 32% in 1859, right, during this era of free trade. Because we really only embraced protective tariffs during the Civil War, and then we had this long period of protective tariffs. But what's funny is from 1859 to 1869, during this era of protection, manufacturing output increased from 32% to 33%. Okay. And this is because we have to realize higher tariffs also make it harder for businesses to import necessary inputs to expand production, right? Okay. So what did the Jacksonians do? How did they do this? How did they achieve what we would consider fairly successful reforms? What was their playbook? Well, they basically did it primarily, though not entirely, but primarily through the executive. The Jacksonians transformed the presidency. And this is a very, very crucial part because the founding fathers were absolutely worried about executive power because that's how the British government, through the colonial governors, had basically been able to control the American people, right? But what happened is that the Jeffersonians, when they took office, when they were able to kick Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists out of power in 1800, they dropped the ball. And they weren't actually able to reform the government. And the legislature really became the source of cronyism, the log rolling, the wasteful expenditures, the bribery, the lobbying, and so on. And the Jacksonians realized you can't achieve reform through the legislature. You can't. And we still can't. I actually think, and I'm going to argue later, that the executive branch has certainly increased its power since World War II, but we often forget how Congress has increased its power in crucial ways to prevent any sort of meaningful reform. So one of the things the Jacksonians did is they vetoed crony legislation. The veto became something that could actually be used to attack cronyism, protective tariffs, internal improvements, rechartering the Second Bank of the United States. The veto from George Washington to John Quincy Adams over a period of about 40 years had been used 10 times, mostly for minor matters. But during the quadrumvirate, it had been used 26 times, right? For substantial economic policies. Most famously, Andrew Jackson vetoed the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States, the hydra of corruption that had bribed politicians, that had a monopoly of the federal deposits, had all sorts of special privileges, providing favors, bribing newspapers, providing favors to banks, politicians, and so on. So I'm going to talk about the veto. I think it's extremely important. The Jacksonians also issued executive orders to more or less dismantle regulatory agencies. Right? Executive orders, they could be used for good. The Jacksonians would say, well, wait a second, the president has the ability to do is the take care clause in the Constitution to make sure the laws are faithfully enforced. And that means that, well, they have control over how money is used. And they have control over if something's constitutional or not. It's not just all the judiciary that gets to decide this. So from about Washington to Adams, executive orders had been used 18 times, but from Jackson to Polk, it was more like 57. I'm not going to agree with all of them, but a lot of them were for quite good. Most famously, Andrew Jackson had vetoed the bank, but it was just a vetoing of its early recharter. And that meant it was still going to last for 4 years, which means it could have a comeback. And so Jackson famously said, the hydra of corruption is only scotched. It's not dead, right? So what do you got to do? Well, he said, we got to remove the federal money from the bank. So he issued an executive order telling the Treasury Department, you got to remove the money. Congress wasn't going to do it. Congress, they own stock in the bank. They were bribed by the bank. They weren't going to enact that reform on their own. So Jackson said, look, I'm in charge. This is what we're going to do. All right. And there's lots of other executive orders could talk about if we had time. Then there's rotation in office, which reduced the entrenched bureaucracy. Basically, Jackson said, our federal bureaucracy considers their jobs property. It's like they get appointed and they just get to stay there. It's like their divine right. And Jackson thought that rotation in office would perpetuate our liberty, actually cycling in new people. This was derided as the so-called spoils system, and there were absolutely problems with it. It was seen as corrupt. But what I would argue is that this rotation in office is only visibly corrupt. Right? Civil service is still corrupt. It's not visible. It's more hidden corruption, right? Because you're creating a group of people that more or less get to form a substantial part of 5 of those 10 counties that are some of the wealthiest counties. right? So, relating to the Bank of the United States, when Jackson issued the executive order, his Secretary of the Treasury didn't want to remove the deposits. Louis McLean, his family owned stock in the bank. He wasn't going to do it, so Jackson said, "You're out." And then he appointed another guy, William J. Duane, and he didn't want to do it. So Jackson said, "All right, you're out." And then he appointed Roger Taney, who did it. And all of this happened when Congress was out of was in recess, because they would have tried to stop it. I'm going to talk about congressional sessions in a little bit, how they relate to today. And I mean, they were apoplectic. I mean, you should have seen them. They were furious. I mean, I wasn't there, I wasn't alive, but I'm saying, you should have seen them. It definitely. They were furious, but they killed the central bank through the executive. We have to realize that. Okay. So, how does this relate to today? I can't guarantee that this playbook will be used by an executive, and while I would love to see it work in the Trump administration, I can't guarantee that. But what I can guarantee is that if during our lifetime, over the next several decades, there is actually going to be meaningful reform through the meaningful reform of the federal government. It's going to occur through this way, most likely, because short of something like secession or state nullification in a substantive way, it's going some reformer is going to be elected president, and they're more or less going to try to change the government through the Jacksonian playbook, which has been the only successful way of actually getting rid of the decreasing government size. Right. So this brings us, of course, to President Trump. Right. It's a great picture. It's an official picture. So Trump, as we all know, he promised to drain the swamp in 2016, and now he made a big point to eliminate a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. And as we know, there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. And I think he certainly, some of the stuff that he's done has been in kind of this Jacksonian sort of spirit. So I could say, achieved victory on the first day of office, basically, right at the beginning. We did it. He's back. Jackson's portrait's back in the White House. Right? Biden had took it out. President Trump had put it back in. So he's right there. So obviously that's just a symbolic sort of ceremonial thing. That doesn't really mean anything. But it means something about sort of the spirit. And I hope this means President Trump will sort of you could say be a sort of a Jacksonian playbook, a president, and govern according to this playbook. So he's certainly not been shy at using executive orders. This is the number of executive orders signed in the first month of each presidential term. And again, I won't agree with all of these executive orders, but there's been a lot of them that I think have been good. He's certainly done more than almost all of his predecessors, combined. Biden, Trump before, Obama, the Bushes, and so on. And this is really because the deep state is against him. It's something like 90% of people in Washington, D.C. did not vote for him. Right. So it's like that's obviously very hostile territory. So what are some of the things he's done that's been in this mold of the Jacksonian playbook? What are some of the things he could do? Remember, we said the Jacksonian playbook is vetoes, executive orders, and rotation in office. So I want to talk about something that he actually could do first, and this is because I think this is really the most important, which is Jacksonian vetoes to dismantle spending, right? Whether something Trump could do or a future president can do, by far the veto is going to have to be the most important tool, I would say, because the spending issue is a huge issue. So believe it or not, there's actually several veto powers that are constitutional that the president can use. You have the regular veto, right, which is basically Congress passes a bill, you need a majority in both houses, both chambers, and then the president has 10 days to sign it or veto it. And if it gets vetoed, then Congress has to have 2/3 support to override the veto. So what I think this could be used for in the most meaningful way is one of the biggest problems that Congress does now is they don't even have separate appropriation bills. They literally just lump everything into these massive, monstrous CRs, continuing resolutions, or omnibus bills, right? You have this sort of this massive just chunk, and it's like this trillions of dollar package. It's filled with all sorts of pork and special interest legislation and privileges, and it's just the president has to say take it or leave it. Unfortunately, the Trump administration was eagerly pushing for the most recent continuing resolution. I think the veto could be used to actually, at some future point, to break up the continuing resolutions and the omnibus bills to go back to the past of actually having separate appropriation bills. That alone won't solve the problem, but it would make it easier to actually try to get rid of stuff, right? So at some point, a president will have to do this because Congress isn't going to do it, right? They benefit from like a take it or leave it, just massive bill, right? Kicking the can down the road saying, yeah, we'll deal with the problem in the future. So that's the regular veto. We also have the pocket veto, which is one of my favorite things, but it's unfortunately more or less fallen into oblivion. The pocket veto, remember we said the president has 10 days to sign a bill, right? And then it automatically becomes law. But if the bill is sent to the president's desk at the end of the congressional session, the president could not do anything. He could just literally run out the clock, right? And then it automatically doesn't become law. And then Congress has to go through the entire thing all over again in order to pass the pass the legislation, try it again. And this is what Jackson did with several internal improvements bills. He basically said, all right, it's at the end of the congressional session. I'm not going to do anything about it. So then it become law. It was a veto. And what's unfortunate is that back in the day, Congress actually only met for about 9 to 10 months out of a 24-month cycle. Right. This was actually really, really important because they were supposed to go back and actually talk to their constituents. But now they basically meet literally all of the time. They are constantly in office to prevent the pocket veto or, as I'll talk about later, recess appointments from actually happening. And they do this for a very deliberate reason to prevent any meaningful reform. So short of Congress actually, recessing on their own, how could we actually, bring back the pocket veto, so to speak? There is an adjournment clause that if one house, like the House of Representatives, disagrees with the Senate on whether or not to adjourn, the president can basically put them into recess. This was something that was floated around when the Senate there was rumblings in the Senate about not appointing or not confirming President Trump's appointments like Pete Hegseth, RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, and stuff. But at some point, I think this will have to be done because the only way to actually get meaningful reform is you have to limit the congressional sessions. You can't just have this where they're meeting literally all of the time. That's legislative overreach, right? Then there's the de facto line item veto, right? Which is sort of the most controversial of them all. Believe it or not, in the 1990s, the last period we actually saw a meaningful decrease in the size of government spending, Congress had actually passed the Line Item Veto Act of 1996, which gave the then President Bill Clinton the ability to basically strike out certain things in a passed bill, sort of line item vetoing it, right? And this was to eliminate wasteful spending. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional, which I think was a real shame because that was probably that could have been used for good. It was declared unconstitutional about 2 years later, though Clinton had used it for about 80 times to eliminate various types of wasteful spending. But there are at least sort of de facto line item vetoes that are still, I would argue, constitutionally possible. So one of them is the so-called signing statement, which is when a bill becomes law and it lands on the president's desk and the president signs it, and then they usually say like, blah, 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 they put something down, and this has been used to expand executive power. Basically, the president is saying how this money will be used or how this regulation will be enforced, but It's actually can be used to decrease government power because really the first major signing statement, technically one was passed by James Monroe or one was done by James Monroe, President James Monroe, but was really Andrew Jackson. He had the first substantive signing statement. And Congress had passed a bill that was pledging to build a road from Detroit in the Michigan territory to Chicago in Illinois, the state of Illinois. And Jackson signed it, but he said, I wish to be understood that the road's only going to go up to the boundary between the two states, because Jackson said that, well, Congress only has authority to engage in public works in territories, not in sovereign states. And Congress adjourned. It was at the end of a congressional session, and of course the Whigs, the opponents of the Democrats, cried foul play and all this stuff. But again, that's how the signing statement could be used. It's something that I think needs to be explored constitutionally. Could it actually be used again to weaken spending? Then there is impoundment, which has certainly been in the news much, much more to impound, basically to impound federal funds. So impoundment refers to the fact that Congress could appropriate money, but the president, as sort of the commander-in-chief, as the head of the executive branch, has the ability to say, okay, how should this money be used? And do we need to spend all this money, right? In a business, money could get appropriated to one, division, but the division's usually going to try to find ways to not use all of the money, right? Because then that could become part of profits. They get a reward. But of course, Congress, really ever since Nixon was using impoundment, has tried to force feed the money, saying the president has to use this money in a certain way. So it's not supposed to be just the maximum amount the president could spend, or various departments in the executive branch could spend. It's supposed to be they have to spend this amount. And I think that's legislative overreach. The president absolutely has some authority, at least, to decide how money should be used or should not be used, and whether all of the money is needed, or whether the money could be used to, say, pay down the national debt. And the Trump administration has been sort of planning on trying to impound federal funds, and this is something that will have to be decided by the Supreme Court or by the executive branch at some point. But I think impoundment of some sort will have to be used to actually meaningfully cut government spending at some point, whether over the next 4 years or over the next several decades. Okay, so those are the vetoes. We haven't seen any vetoes by President Trump, but we have seen executive orders in rotation in office, and I want to talk about some of those. So, what are some Jacksonian executive orders to fight waste, fraud, and abuse? So probably the most prominent one that most people know about is the executive order to establish the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, right, named after the famous the Doge coin, which is named after the famous Doge dog. And this is really just an executive order to transform this more or less defunct part of the White House, like the U.S. Digital Service, something like that, and to make it a watchdog that basically has the ability to scrutinize how the money Congress has appropriated is actually used. And it's led by senior advisor to the president, Elon Musk, who started off by saying we could cut $2 trillion from the budget, and I wish them a lot of success. I mean, they have the ability to at least look at how funds are used and cancel some contracts, terminate some leases and stuff. But, Doge itself can't do the whole job. And of course, everyone's crying foul play and saying that, all the stuff is unconstitutional. But I do agree with my friend and colleague, Tho Bishop, that Doge's biggest strength is publicizing cronyism. Right, because the big thing is that Elon Musk is also, he's got X, or he's got Twitter, which means he can move around the traditional mainstream media outlets and just literally post up to millions of people, post on the social media website all of the ways in which money is being used, the slush funds, the cozy grant, research grants or foundation grants, all the ways in which the money is being spent at various agencies no one's ever heard of. And when you actually look at some of these buildings, they're palatial. And again, it all relates to that fact that 5 out of 10 of the richest counties in terms of median household income are located in the Beltway. So I want Doge to succeed. We will see if it does succeed or if it will become a Doge and pony show, I guess is one way of putting it. Right. But I think something like this will have to be done in a future administration, some sort of arm of the White House to kind of really investigate, put sunlight onto all the spending cronyism, the regulatory cronyism. There. So we also have Jacksonian executive orders to deregulate. Right, we have all the regulatory agencies in the executive department. So many of them are the highly vaunted independent regulatory agencies, which means they are insulated from political control. The appointees served fixed terms, which means sometimes presidents can't cycle out the heads and they can more or less do whatever they want, which means they can pretty much provide special privileges to the relevant interest groups, cartelize industry, discriminate against rivals, so on and so forth. I mean, we have OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the FDIC, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Labor Relations Board, so on and so forth. So what has Trump done to at least try to rein in some of these agencies? Well, one executive order is called Ensuring Accountability for All Agencies, and this is seen as very controversial because, again, he's attacking these nonpartisan independent agencies. And basically, what the executive order says is that, well, you're part of the executive branch, right? And now you have to report to the White House. I think it's like the Office of Management and Budget, or the president directly. If you want to pass a new regulation, a new major regulation, how that's defined, you basically have to get approval from the CEO, so to speak, of the government, which is the president. So that can stop regulatory overreach. And I think, again, that's important. This is something that could be used in a good way. You also have another executive order that was passed. It was called Unleashing Prosperity Through Deregulation, right? And this is heavily related to the above executive order. And this Unleashing Prosperity Through Deregulation executive order institutes a so-called 1 in 10 out rule, which is that if an agency wants to pass one regulation, they have to get rid of 10 other regulations, right? And the net cost of the regulatory burden each year has to be less than zero. It's something like that. And again, this can be used for good because if the executive branch, if the president actually wants to decrease the regulatory burden, now these agencies, they're held accountable, right? So I hope that something like this succeeds. I can't promise it, but again, in the future, something like this will have to be done, or something like this will continue to have to be done in future administrations, trying to bring these regulatory agencies to heal. And one of the things that's implied in this is that if the president has more authority, the president also has more authority over the heads. They can't just have these fixed terms, right? They could get fired or they could get replaced. And the president also has more authority over the budgets, right? So, the budgets could go down, the appropriations could go down if they keep cutting regulations, right? So this is for those agencies that might, that Trump hasn't been able to actually appoint someone to. What about, say, the cabinets or the departments that Trump is actually able to appoint someone to? So this is where I think the Jacksonian rotation in office to downsize the bureaucracy must come into play. So What I'm referring to is basically appointments to dismantle from the inside. You're getting someone who's a friendly ally who can actually try to achieve meaningful change to, say, a department or some other thing that the president does have more direct control over, right? So I think one of the most important appointments, and I hope this bears fruit, is Russ Vought, who is the OMB director, which is the Office of Management and Budget in the White House, and he's the acting CFPB director, right? The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And this is something that Republicans have tried to get rid of for over a decade, hasn't really succeeded. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, of course, really just benefits trial lawyers who are able to make lots of money from lawsuits, class action lawsuits against something banks or financial institutions did or did not do that really has nothing to do with efficiency, but it's a way of, again, creating work for trial lawyers. And as head of the OMB, he's basically the person that all of those agencies now have to report to. So he has the ability to achieve some pretty substantive changes if he's actually able to get it through. As head of the CFPB, as the acting director, he's basically told everyone to not show up to work and is planning on asking for $0 in appropriations next quarter. Again, whether or not this succeeds, it's a step in the right direction. It's something that we could learn from, again, if we're actually trying to change government in the here and now. You also have Linda McMahon, who's the Secretary of Education, the Department of Education. This is something Republicans have tried to dismantle for decades, hasn't succeeded. And of course, as libertarians, we're not a fan of the federal government taking control of education. The Department of Education exists to benefit teachers' unions and administrators, right? We all know the stories. The test scores haven't improved. It just, the learning standards have declined. But what it does do is it benefits administrators and people who want more control over the education process, so on and so forth. And about 2 days ago, Trump issued an executive order basically empowering her to dismantle the Department of Education. She's already gotten rid of about half of the workforce. And I hope she succeeds. I hope they're actually able to get rid of the hydra of corruption, right? In this aspect of our lives. And someone else could be someone like Lee Zeldin, administrator of the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, who's been at the forefront recently, basically canceling a lot of cushy sort of research grants and other sorts of subsidies to a lot of foundations or various beneficiaries of the government. The EPA is in charge of a lot of our environmental regulations, Green New Deal, cronyism, all sorts of stuff like that. And the president does have the ability to appoint someone to lead this department directly. And again, I wish these individuals the best of success. Whether or not they succeed right now is somewhat immaterial to the point I'm trying to make, which is that something like this will have to be done in the future. So just one final point I want to mention is that a big roadblock that we all heard about in January and February was that in order for the president to appoint someone, it has to get confirmed by the Senate. And this is where you get the political theater, the pyrotechnics, the bells and whistles, and all sorts of stuff. And in the Senate Republicans, they're always ready to fumble the ball at the goal line, right? Like they're just always ready to kind of stand up for principles when it's like the most inexpedient, ridiculous time to do so. And it's not even good principles. And that's because the Senate has a lot of entrenched cronyism. Lots of senators have lots of money and lots of power. Of course, one of the senators who's been sort of routinely in Trump's thorn is a senator from Alaska, Murkowski, who her and her father have literally ruled that Senate seat for like 40 years. There's a whole interesting story behind that. But anyway, and we could go on to all of the various senators and the interests that they represent. But one of the things that, again, the Senate has sort of adamantly tried to prevent is any sort of recess appointment because they meet constantly. So back in the day, the president could at least appoint people when Congress was out of session, and well, they maybe have the Senate to confirm someone who was sort of more of a moderate. The Jacksonians, they could get rid of people when Congress is out of session, right? This is how Jackson got rid of the bank. It was only when Congress was out of session. All right. So anyway, I want to conclude, and I want to state that dismantling the deep state is possible. Right? Is it likely? Well, maybe, but I think it's possible. And I think it's something that can actually be done in our lifetime. We could try to get rid of that entrenched cronyism. I'm not going to say it's going to be perfect. I'm not going to say it won't be messy, but I am going to say it could be done. In that spirit of Murray Rothbard, we could achieve liberty in our time. There is a strategy in the here and now for how to actually do something, right? And I think that the institutional reforms, the free market reforms that economists prioritize and they praise, can be achieved constitutionally through the executive. This is something that the Jacksonians did really the last time it was really successful. And I think it's something that could be done now. And it's absolutely not without its risks. If I had more time, I would talk about how executive power corrupts and, power corrupts. Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. We can't forget what Lord Acton said. But what else has worked? If you do what you've done, you'll get what you've got. Right? That's something we all need to realize, right? So we need to sort of move away from kind of a pro-legislature mindset to a pro-executive mindset. So I think with that, I will conclude. Hopefully you didn't feel too abused. So thank you very much. I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you for the great presentation. What do you think about the risk? I mean, you kind of mentioned at the end that it backfires and then a second president makes it worse. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important risk. It kind of goes back down to what else has worked, and a worse president could use the same machinery we have now and just get Congress to pass all sorts of interventionist legislation. So I kind of go back to the fact that what has worked right in the past, and it wasn't perfect, but we sort of have to learn from that and build on it. I mean, it's basically it's the chance for real change, or it's kind of just the slow or not so slow death, right? That's the idea, I would say.
Patrick, you said that the Jacksonians destroyed the American system. I think it's more accurate to say they prevented it from existing in the first place. Hamilton coined that phrase, and then, of course, after his death, Henry Clay picked it up. But they had no success. They didn't have big federal subsidies for railroads or anything like that. They had basically free trade. 1857, the average tariff rate was 15%. They did get rid of the bank, but then it was created by Lincoln. And that's where the deep state started, because but it was started through war and mass murder, and the waging of total war on the civilian population of the South. And I don't think that's going to happen again. And so I think it'll be easier this time to get rid of the deep state, because it was put in place by total war. It was that's how it all came into being during Lincoln. And so that's one comment. Another comment is Grover Cleveland vetoed more than 400 spending bills. So would you consider him to be the last Jacksonian?
Yeah, there's all great comments. So definitely, I wouldn't deny that Lincoln in the very Whiggish sort of Republicans during the Civil War brought back the central banking system, the National Banking Acts, protective tariffs, transcontinental railroad subsidies. But by Jackson's administration, when it began in 1829, we had a central bank that the Supreme Court had basically said was constitutional. Right, through McCulloch v. Maryland, we had protective tariffs, the tariff of abomination. And while internal improvements had sort of fractured They weren't able to be passed at the federal level. There was the 1824 Survey Act, basically setting the groundwork for a system of internal improvements. And at the state level, lots of states were able to pass all sorts of pork, the Erie Canal, in New York, et cetera. So I think the Jacksonians, there was the basic structure of the American system that the Jacksonians were able to get rid of, and I think that's very important. And of course, it's unfortunate that their long-lasting institutional reforms didn't, they got reversed by the Civil War. Grover Cleveland, I think he was a Jacksonian president. He basically vetoed and he stopped spending. And you could make the argument that even Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge were sort of Jacksonian in their own right. Warren Harding, his administration created the Bureau of the Budget, which became the Office of Management and Budget later on. And Calvin Coolidge famously vetoed lots of veterans benefits, agricultural subsidies, and so on. So I think, again, the playbook is to achieve reform. When we've seen reform achieved in American history, it's been through an executive who's kind of flexing their muscles. And of course, there's absolute pitfalls with that. Again, it kind of just goes back to what has worked in the past. Yeah.
That's all the time we have. Thank you, Dr. Newman.